Hello, everyone. My name is John. As Nikki mentioned, I'm a senior product manager at Uber. I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, so just to begin with a bit of an introduction on my background here, I currently do work at Uber on our Uber Direct team, which is Uber's B2B on-demand delivery service. And prior to that, I've worked in a number of product roles across primarily B2C and varying sized companies. So I began my career after graduating from Tufts in 2013 and immediately joined TripAdvisor in a rotational program where I rotated across a number of product organizations before landing with our search and discovery team. And I've added to this slide some details on the size and scope and focus of the different companies that I've worked for, even though a few of these may be familiar to you, because it is relevant to the content that we're going to be going through, which is primarily discussing the differences and similarities of product work across large enterprise companies, smaller startups, consumer-facing, or B2B enterprise-facing companies. After working at TripAdvisor for about 4 years, I moved on to join Blue Apron, originally in the growth product role team before moving on to lead the member experience squad there. And that was a step in a smaller direction from a company size and scope and stage standpoint. From there, after about 2 years, I moved to an even smaller company called Pillar, which was a B2C fintech app focused on the student loan space as their head of product and first product hire. I was there for about 2 years before joining Uber this past year in 2020. And to put a finer point on the size of these varying teams, what we're talking about here is essentially moving to smaller and smaller companies to expand ownership and my mandate. And then returning back to an even larger corporation that I've worked at before to kind of reset and learn. And I've illustrated here kind of the number of product managers that were on staff at each of these companies while I was there. And you can really see the trajectory was to move to smaller places, expand my ownership, and then more recently come back to Uber to kind of reset. And through that experience, I want to talk to you guys today about the varying responsibilities and roles of product managers when you're talking about an extremely small startup like Pillar, where I was the only product person setting the vision as well as executing on all product related tasks. And then going to the other extreme at a place like Uber, which has 25,000 employees and hundreds of product managers. So moving on from there, a few takeaways that we're going to talk about today are that roles and responsibilities vary by company, they vary by industry, they vary by stage. To oversimplify extremely, smaller companies are simpler organizations. They have less weight under the hood, less technical debt, less technical complexity. But the product manager's role may be more technical in these spaces because you don't have the support staff that a larger company has built out. Larger companies are more complex organizations. There's more of a navigational aspect to the product role. You need to understand how your team fits into the broader organization, how you can negotiate the different relationships that you may have with stakeholders and other product teams to achieve the outcomes that you're trying to drive. And that occupies a lot of your time and attention. So you have a much more specialized set of responsibilities than you will have at a much smaller company. But there are some consistent things that you're going to be responsible for across all of these different organizational structures. And primarily that's to deliver outcomes, not to master individual skills. So there is no kind of rubric of these are the things a product manager must necessarily know in order to be successful. What you really are trying to do is set the course for your team, understand what your goals are, measure how they're going to be successful, and then deliver on those. Diving into that a little more deeply, that kind of boils down to knowing what you need to know and confidently delegating the rest. So you don't need to understand every detail of a product area, but you do need to understand where you should be leaning in and where you should be stepping back. And on that point, just to, again, reinforce it, time management and relationship building are extremely important and critical regardless of the size or scope of the organization, because the role of a product manager is to live at the intersection of a variety of stakeholders, but they become increasingly critical as your career matures and your mandate, the area of ownership, your level of personal responsibility expands, and you need to be able to extend yourself, not simply by putting in longer hours, but by using your time more wisely. So take a step back and think about how product managerial roles differ across these different sized companies or different scopes. We really need to understand what a product manager is. I know this is extremely basic, but to start from here, we can build forward. What Sharif, a distinguished product manager at Atlassian, I don't really know what distinguished means, but good for Sharif. A product manager is the person who identifies the customer need and the larger business objectives that a product or feature will fulfill, articulates what success looks like for a product, and then rallies the team to turn that vision into a reality. I think this is a fairly good definition, although I will say that this definition does miss one key element of a product manager's role that I've experienced, which is that product managers need to understand the customer needs, absolutely. They need to understand the business objectives, absolutely as well. And in most cases, although not necessarily all, the product manager also needs to be familiar with the technical solutions that can be used to solve these customer needs and achieve these business objectives. So I really like this kind of three-sided Venn diagram, thinking about the role of the PM as the point of the intersection between these three key areas. And from that perspective, we should say that great PMs are not mini CEOs. I know this is a phrase that has been thrown around a lot. This may be something that has already been debunked or gone out of vogue. But the concept of PM as mini CEO does kind of underplay some of the relative competencies that a product manager needs to have that a really strong CEO who's more focused in this business objective area, potentially with overlap of customer needs, but really hanging out in this space, does not necessarily need to have. So the competencies for a product manager tend to be more diverse than the CEO, as unlikely as that sounds. And then last point here, the relative importance of these competencies, which we'll talk about in a minute, vary based on a few different dimensions. So they can vary based on the company's culture, industry, business model, structure, size, or stage. A few examples here. For example, you may have heard like Airbnb has an extremely strong company culture that's design focused. So their product managers may have more of a design background, whereas a company like Google historically enjoyed or preferred to promote more technical product managers who had strong technical foundations, potentially were engineers or software developers prior to becoming PMs, because they really wanted to emphasize that PM engineer relationship. When we think about these PM competencies, we can really see the varying areas that a PM could be leaning into or leaning away from. So this is a hypothetical situation where we're looking at a product manager breaking down his or her skills across these 7 different areas or competencies. And at Corpotech, our fake company here, we're going to say that communication skills, UX design, and product marketing are more important competencies than technical proficiency or analytical skills or project management. So looking at them on this scale and looking at this distribution of competencies, we could make a few assumptions or hypotheses, estimated guesses about what size and what area or what sort of business model Corpotech is involved in. And the size of the organization here, I would strongly suggest, is a larger company where your communication skills, your business sense, your product marketing skills potentially are extremely important, but you don't necessarily have to be particularly technically proficient or analytical from a technical standpoint, like writing your own SQL queries, for example, because there are other individuals in your immediate vicinity whose job it is to handle those areas, and you can focus much more on communicating, setting a vision, et cetera. Now, this is a quirky company in that they prioritize UX design incredibly highly for product managers, potentially more so than business sense or project management. All of these things will vary depending on the culture that's developed, the leadership of the product organization, the structure. So what sort of roles exist in the company. And they'll also vary based on what the expectations of leadership are or what the needs of your particular team are at the time. So if your team is shorthanded or has relatively weak engineering leadership, you may have to take a larger role in helping set the engineering agenda. Similarly, analytically, depending on the infrastructure that exists at your company, the analysts that are available, if any, you may have to lean in more or less. One example there, at TripAdvisor, the company culture, although there were data scientists who were involved in helping dig into the data and glean insights, it was expected that product managers would pull their own data, write their own queries, and produce the reports that were needed to get a read on the performance of the features they were owning and building. So moving forward, how does this influence the kind of classic software development lifecycle that we love to talk about? Just to reiterate, this is probably something very similar to something you've seen before, but like going all the way back to Eric Rice and the lean startup days, there's this concept of the agile software development lifecycle that follows these basic 5 steps, starting from requirement analysis or scoping through design implementation testing, and then evolution, which is essentially repeating that cycle. When we're thinking about large enterprises versus small startups, just to focus on one of these 5, starting with the requirement analysis or scoping piece, we're going to take a quick detour and do a somewhat deeper dive here. And look on the large enterprise side, these are fairly intuitive takeaways, but there's more process, there are more stakeholders, but you may also have more clarity on what needs to be built. Now, granted, this all depends on the stage of your particular product area. So large enterprises often do enter into uncharted territory where they're trying to build something from scratch or enter a new vertical. And they may not necessarily have the clarity that they're looking for as to what the proper solution to the problem set is, or even what problems they're trying to solve. But in most cases, you're going to have product market fit, you're going to have a foundational product that you're building on top of, and therefore the next steps of what needs to be built are somewhat more clearly defined than when you're thinking about building from a small startup where you're truly operating under more market risk than you are execution risk when it comes to assessing how likely you are to succeed or fail. In the small startup space, you can move much more quickly. You have fewer stakeholders, you have less process, less baggage weighing you down, less technical debt, but there's also a lot more uncertainty, which means you're forced to move more quickly because you need to speed through this SDLC cycle to gather data, inform your decisions, understand whether you're achieving product market fit, understand whether your product is actually solving the problems you want, and grow from there. So, when we're thinking about the enterprise situation here, just in this requirement analysis step, you may know where you want to go, but getting alignment is hard. Here is just like a small handful of all of the stakeholders who may be trying to have their voice heard and deserve and need to have their voices heard before a feature, even a small one, can potentially get released to your audience. You might have legal stakeholders, user research influencing you, product or strategic leadership that never really goes away. You have dependent teams who are building things in parallel, who may have dependencies on you or your team has dependencies on them. You have customer support, you have operations, you have all of the financial, tax, accounting, marketing, and CRM infrastructure and scaffolding that surrounds the product that has been built out there. So your scope is more narrow, but you have a lot of stakeholders to wrangle. And that's really why communication is incredibly important in this enterprise PM space. You need to be able to synthesize all of these potentially conflicting needs, drive to alignment, get everyone on board, make sure that they are feeling heard and that their pieces of the project are also being scoped in tandem, such that when you release a new feature or you launch a new product, you have everyone in the organization who is affected by it aware, informed, and on the same page so that customer support knows what products are coming down the pipe and they're prepared to do those sorts of things. Conversely, in the startup world, you have fewer stakeholders. So if you're looking to the number of people who are trying to influence this decision, and again, I'm starting from an extremely small startup perspective. If you're at a mid-sized company or a later stage startup, you may have more stakeholders that look like this, but they're easier to get a hold of and easier to get alignment with than they are in an extremely large company. But let's go back to the extremely small example. You have a very small team that is influencing the requirements, but you do have a lot more questions. You have less certainty. You have questions that you need to be thinking about even more aggressively than you would in the enterprise situation. None of these are questions that you should not be asking. They're all relevant in the enterprise, larger company situation as well. If you're not asking questions like, what will this teach us? Is this the best use of resources? How will we measure success? You're going to have trouble in the enterprise space as well. But when you are working in a small company, you have very limited resources, you have fewer chances, you have no room for error. You really need to understand, like, hey, how will we measure success? Is this the best use of resources? You also have these kind of executional details that in larger companies you don't have to worry about. So do we have tracking, or do we have an email service provider, or do we have customer support set up? How are we going to manage questions or confusion on the part of our users if they don't understand how to use this feature? All of those things become problems for the PM to solve when you don't have the support network in place. So there are obviously pros and cons of working in each of these environments. And you can kind of, in an extremely oversimplified framework, plot them along this confidence versus speed matrix. The role of the product manager in both of these environments is to drive to the top right quadrant on this matrix as much as you possibly can. So if we look at this line kind of in aggregate here, we have B2B enterprises at highest confidence but slowest to move, and B2C startups as the fastest but least confident space to be moving through. The difference between B2B and B2C we can get into for a quick second here. This primarily comes down to the fact that depending on the B2B model, you usually have more confidence that users you acquire, companies, clients, customers you acquire are going to be locked in for a longer period of time and are also more resistant to change than consumers in a B2C context. So rolling out changes if you have a product that B2B enterprises are relying on becomes more challenging. You need to make sure that your end customer's experience is not disrupted in a way that's problematic for them, that slows you down. For example, if you're offering an API as a service, if you make breaking changes to your API that require your end customers to make changes on their side, that is an extremely high cost change. You need to move slowly because you need to make sure that all of your high value customers are on board with this change, aware of it, prepared for it, ready to move forward with you. And the vendor lockup piece comes back to the business model, but in many cases, you may have customers who have signed contracts, so churn is not as common or as frequent an occurrence. So you have more latitude and more runway to work through these kinds of roadblocks and challenges than you do in the B2C space. So consistent through lines across these various dimensions, yeah, there are definitely a lot. What you need to be able to do in both the startup space and the large enterprise space comes back to, on the whole, communicating clearly. And this is the most important thing that a product manager can do in any situation. You need to be able to drive the vision for your area of ownership and make sure that all of your stakeholders are on board and aligned with that vision. That doesn't mean you just create a strategy deck once a quarter or once a half or once a year and leave it on Google Drive or in your knowledge base for whatever your company uses and just let it sit there. You have to reiterate it frequently and make sure that all of your stakeholders understand how your features that you're building on your roadmap ladder up to that strategy and how that strategy ladders up to the broader company mission, vision, or strategy if you are just working on a small team within a larger organization. And that communication comes back to setting specific metrics that you need to be able to hit, and communicating to users in plain English. Sorry, by users, I mean internal stakeholders, how those metrics actually drive the real value that you are trying to create. So you can't just say, here's a KPI that we have. We're going to use Uber's example, we're going to improve the star ratings that our drivers collect by, here's a whole roadmap of projects that we have that can ladder up to improving driver ratings. Frankly, we need to be able to take the next step and say, okay, why do driver star ratings matter? Who do they matter to? How do they tie back to the key business objectives that Uber cares about? Do we have any historical data that can prove that connection? If not, are there ways to collect it? And if not, are we sure this is the right metric that will help us achieve what we want to do? And all that comes back to communication. In the small startup space, you may have fewer stakeholders that you need to align, but each of their influences is much higher. So you have leadership at the company that may be resistant possibly to a product leader setting a product strategy that does not 100% align with what the CEO's vision for the product should be. And you need to be able to communicate, understand the perspective of the CEO or other company leaders, listen to them thoroughly, offer them the right sort of explanations for why you believe your mission or your vision, your strategy aligns with their vision, and why your strategy is the best possible way to get to where you collectively as a company want to go. And if you're not speaking on the same level as that person, then you should probably understand why they're thinking about this differently from you. Moving forward from there, I know we're running out of time here. So just specifically, clear documentation is even more important. Building strong relationships, extremely important as well. This often comes with communication, but it means that even as your time is being pulled in a variety of directions, you need to be able to empathize with your stakeholders, understand their perspective. It's not only the end user who you need to be able to empathize with and understand. You need to understand your internal stakeholders as well. And that really comes back to benefit you as the product manager, because you'll more likely receive the benefit of the doubt from people who trust you and believe that you have their best interests at heart. You're not ignoring their needs. You're just making strategic trade-offs, which is necessary. And you need to be able to say no very frequently as a product manager, because you will have internal stakeholders or features that you desperately want to build that you don't have the resources for. Prioritization is absolutely essential. And that means saying no to a lot of things. The stronger your relationships are, the better you can say no. And the more frequently you can say no without damaging the trust that you've built. It also helps you get meaningful feedback from individuals, both externally and internally, that can help you develop as a product manager. Here are a few differences between startups and enterprise in relationship management. In the startup space, you're really asking for people's trust because you have little data in your hypotheses. So you should be leveraging what data you have, but there's a lot of leap of faiths that need to be taken in the startup space. And so you need to be able to build that trust and build strong relationships so that you can ask people to go along for the ride with you. Everything is more personal in the startup space, just as a result of the fact that there is no large structural issues standing in the way of achieving an outcome. When you're a small company, it's really tough to blame the organization and the bureaucracy for things that did not go well. That makes it more difficult to maintain these strong relationships because people can take things personally. So you need to make sure that, again, you're not making things personal when they don't have to be, and you're building a strong foundation. And things can change very quickly. On the enterprise side, you need to be able to build strong relationships so you can align stakeholders with differing incentives or motivations. It's tough to get everyone on the same page when there are across 20 different teams that may have competing interests. So you might have a legal team that is really resistant to pushing something forward because it appears to be a legal or regulatory risk, while you have strategic leadership on the product or technical side that says this is something that absolutely needs to be done, or something that if we avoid will cost us in other ways. And you need to be able to reach a compromise or get everyone on board with your preferred solution. And then again, you want to be able to deliver outcomes, not features. That helps achieve all of the previous objectives. If you're delivering on outcomes, not specifically features, you can communicate your vision more clearly because you're focused on those outcomes. You're not handing people a laundry list of features and telling them, hey, here, this is what we're going to do. You figure out why it's the most important thing to do, or you figure out why these are relevant. And it can also help you focus your team's attention on what really matters and push for that maximum speed with maximum confidence. And then the last piece here is just managing your time judiciously. So in both of these cases, in the small startup space, you might be asked to own everything from your analytics platform to your CRM platform to your customer service platform. You might be writing customer support ticket responses at the same time that you're trying to write SQL queries, and you somehow still need to be able to set a product roadmap and write PRDs. Your time is going to be stretched very thin. You need to be able to ruthlessly prioritize. I know that's cliche. And in the large enterprise space, there are more individuals vying for your time as well. So you need to, again, protect yourself there. So that's the last piece that I had here. I know we're at time. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me as I rambled through that. But thank you so much. I'm happy, Nikki, to take any questions if we have a minute or two.
Yeah, definitely. If we can take some time for maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. And thank you so much.
Hi, John. It's Asghar here. Quite good presentation. Just a quick one. You talked about vision and goals as part of the communication, and I'm totally with you. From your experience point of view, how long ahead vision should look? Is there like a time limit on how long ahead one should be defining or communicating a vision? And similarly, like strategic goals or product strategy, how long ahead product manager should be defining that? Yeah.
That's a really great question because it does vary depending on the situation. I would say to be extremely to overgeneralize, the larger the organization, the longer you should be projecting forward because the less likely things are to change dramatically, and the more teams you need to align behind a unified vision because there are downstream dependencies and those rows of dominoes that need to be set up. So in a large enterprise setting, you're probably trying to think 6 to 12 months in advance. And not adjusting your roadmap significantly within the 3 to 6 month period. Whereas at a much smaller company, you might only be thinking 1 or 2 sprints into the future. So 2 weeks, 4 weeks. You should have a higher level vision of what you're trying to achieve, but the individual features you're prioritizing absolutely will vary much more frequently when you have less confidence and are moving more quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for this.
Yeah. Thank you.